that I want to do is, just so I have it on tape, if I could just get your first and last name and the correct spelling so I have it on tape.
Okay, first name is Eugene. That's Eugene. Middle initial is D, which stands for Duncan, my middle name, Duncan. Last name Pember, Pember.
Now, I discovered a gentleman that was just in, and I noticed that all the vets always write their middle initial, and I wondered why that was, and he told me that in the service, at least his experience was, first name, middle initial. They didn't care about the last name by the time you got to there. So I don't know if that's true or not.
No, if you didn't have a middle initial, they put it in parentheses, NMI.
NMI, no middle. Now, which branch of the service were you in?
Well, initially in the Air Corps, and then later when it became the Air Force. So I started out in the Air Corps.
So you must have done a career almost then.
No, not really.
Oh, really?
No, I got out at the end of the war. But I started actually in flying training as an Air Force pilot. And it would have been October of 1941. Flying training at Oxnard, California. Army Air Base, they called it, which was primary training. And then from there on up to Mentor Field in Bakersfield, California, for basic, and then to Stockton Army Air Base in Sacramento.
Huh.
Graduated from there.
Where were you when you heard about Pearl Harbor?
Very interesting story.
I'm going in the other room. The chair is a little more comfortable.
Okay.
Not quite so bright.
Here, we get that door for you there. So
that was in primary school. So December the 7th, right? I was walking off what they call gigs for having received demerits for some misfeasance or malfeasance. Either my beds hadn't been made correctly, or they'd found dust on the top of my dresser or something like that. Or I didn't get a high score in one of the tests that were given to us so frequently. And they gave us gigs to walk off out there. And everybody was on base was gone except three of us, I guess, that were walking off these gigs. And we were supposed to keep quiet and walk in a military style around a kind of square. And one of the fellows started calling to us. He says, hey, something's happened. Keep quiet, you're going to get us in trouble. He had one of the very earliest of the little portable radios, handheld radio. I'd even forgotten that now that they even had them that far back, but he had one for some reason. And he said, no, this is very important. It sounds like it. And he says, shut up. And his name was Ryan. Shut up, Ryan. The officer of the day will come out here and we'll be walking tours forever. No, he said, listen, they bombed some place called Pearl Harbor. Who? The Japanese bombed some place called Pearl Harbor. Oh, well, that's different. So then the question became, where's Pearl Harbor? I think we had it placed all over the globe except in the right place. Nobody knew where Pearl Harbor was. Anyhow, that's where we first heard, out there walking off tours at Oxnard Air Force Base on December the 7th.
Did you have any idea what that meant to your future career?
Well, we were well enough aware of the fact that any time the Japanese had bombed something that belonged to the United States, that they were going to accelerate our training, and we'd be involved directly in that, or assumed that we would be anyhow.
When you enlisted, did you know that, did you have a pretty good idea we were going to war?
No idea at all. I had no idea at all. I wasn't interested in politics, didn't follow them. All I was interested in was a flying career, and I wanted to get into the Air Force because that seemed to me to be the best thing to do. Plus the fact that the Army, I had what do they call it? You had to sign up for the draft. I guess that was it. And our local draft board was breathing down my neck. That wasn't the reason I signed up, but it was a kind of a tug of war. As a matter of fact, I got 2 or 3 extensions of my draft board call because I had applied for this, and they somehow or another they messed my papers up and they didn't come through. And I sent a telegram to the Secretary of War saying, if you want my body, words to that effect, you'd better call me now, because I'd gotten a phone call from our draft board director, who was a woman there in Alhambra, where I lived at that time. She said, you've used up all your extensions. You can expect a call within the next week, I think it was. So I really sent a telegram, and it came back immediately. They assigned me to a school. I was so happy to tell her about that.
And you wanted to fly, that was your dream, or?
Oh, as a kid I grew up wanting to fly, yeah. We lived in a little town north of Los Angeles called Newhall. They had an emergency landing strip there for the commercial airlines. And it didn't take a very big strip for a commercial airplane to land in those days. There was a little valley up there. And we'd watch them take off and land in bad weather up there. And one of the very first of the World War I movies that was made, and made in sound, was made there on my, at that time, former wife's grandfather's field out there, where the little World War I airplanes could take off and land in your backyard. So they made that there. They used to let school out to go out and watch them.
Huh.
That's how big it was, a deal of that kind. And then got the plane that was carrying the Johnsons, Osa, and I forget what her husband's name was, Johnson, who were at that time the most prominent people in collecting animals from Africa for zoos and for circuses and stuff like that. They were world known for their abilities and what they'd done in that respect. It crashed right on top of a mountain, just in view from a big picture window from our house. Last mountain that you let down from coming north into Los Angeles, and they hit just 200 feet below the top of it. And so we, as kids, one of my best friends and I, we used to hike up there and bring back pieces of it. Yeah, it was very exciting. We want to do that too. And he, my friend, became a pilot before I did. He was a year older than I, and a year older in school, and he went off to college before I did and took up flying while he was there. And he took me for my first ride. He retired as a full colonel from the Air Force.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what, now you went on and became full pilot, right? You got your pilot's credentials and did all that?
Yeah.
What did you fly? What type of?
Well, initially in flying, we started out in PT-17s, which were Stearman biplane. And in basic training, it was AT-6s, which were built by Vultee, as they called them, Vultee vibrators. It was 100,000 nuts and bolts in loose formation. It was a very noisy airplane. Then we went to AT-6, was built by North American. It was a much more refined airplane, like going from a Ford to a Cadillac. And then I went in fighter transition. I flew P-40s. It's the ones, the Flying Tigers, the ones that most people are familiar with. And then I flew some P-38s in transition, and then P-51s. It's a Mustang.
And now the P-40, that's how big a crew? 2?
No, these are all single engine. Single pilot, one
Single.
pilot, yeah.
So your duty then, so when you left the States then, where did you end up serving?
Well, for a long time I was an instructor pilot. I taught flying in basic and advanced school. And I didn't get into actually anything towards the very end of the war, because they kept upgrading me and sending me to places to do things, and you're too valuable to go on. And I said, I want to go. In fact, Dougie's husband at that time, was a widowed by, he was a classmate of mine. And he got on the list to go, and they sent him. I was on the list, and they just never sent me, so it took a long time to get cut free. So I got over towards to the end of the war in the Pacific, so, the 49th Fighter Group.
How long was it? How fast were they turning out pilots that you were training? I mean, was it a pretty hurry-up program, or?
Well, it was, yeah, I guess you could call it an accelerated program. They were training pilots as fast as they could. Yeah, I did most of my instruction at what was called Merced Air Base in Merced, California. Later became a B-52 base. But yeah, we trained a lot of pilots there. I was squadron commander.
So how would you train? I mean, because these are all fighter planes that you're training them on, right?
No, these are the planes that they learn to fly before they go into whatever they go into later. This was, I say, primary, basic, and advanced. And I was training there in basic and then in advanced school. And these are the things that then people are selected or select themselves to go into either single engine or multi-engine flying. So they'd go either to fighters or to bombers, transport, something of that kind.
Was there a prime plane that people wanted to go for? I mean, was there that one?
Well, I think everybody wanted to be a fighter pilot, you know. The P-38 was the one. When we were in primary there in Oxnard, we weren't too far from Lockheed where they were building the P-38s. And every once in a while when we were at retreat there in the evening, when you were saluting the flag and standing at attention and getting ready to break up to go eat into mess and to back to your own rooms and whatever. There's always some kind of fog around there, low fog scud coming in off the ocean. But they'd hear this kind of an eerie whine, and Milo Burcham, who was the chief test pilot for Lockheed, was aware we were there. He would come up and he would come down, swoop down out of the fog and come right over the top of us in a big circle. That was thrilling.
Just to rub it in a little bit that he had this hotshot plane and,
Yeah.
Now the flyboys, they were if I understand right, the women liked the men in the flyboy uniforms. They were.
Oh, that was glamorous, sure. What the heck? You know, that was certainly some attraction there.
Now, did you have to train them? Did you do just basic training with them, or did you actually then take them up once they went through their basic and do fight training in the area that you were at, or did they go somewhere else for that?
No, as I say, we had first basic training at our school and then developed into an advanced training school too. So we went from BTs to ATs. However, after they left there, they went to specialized schools. So you either went to a fighter transition or a bomber transition. So those would be other places wherever, all over the country.
And how big of class roughly did you have at a time? I mean, how many kids were you pumping through there?
I don't know. I don't ever think I ever thought of it in the numbers of people going through. It would take me a little while to figure up the number of ones that I had when I was the commander of a training squadron. Probably had 50 people, I guess, and we had several different squadrons and training at all times there. So
there had to be planes coming and going and up, and I mean, it just had to be a crazy environment with all that going on.
Well, of course, it was well controlled. You know, we were only one of a number of flying schools.
Up and down. I think my dad ended up down in Texas somewhere. He kept getting washed out. He was right at the end of the war, so he kept getting washed out of all the programs as they went along, and he never finished his.
They closed up, yeah.
Yep, yep, and then they'd send him to the next program, and they'd send him to the next.
Yeah, that happened.
Did you enjoy your time in the service?
Oh, yeah, it was a wonderful time, yeah.
Do you think it prepared you for the rest of your life? I mean, was it a good training for you for whatever you moved on to do after that, or?
Well, it was a pretty good training for most anything. It was, yeah, well, we had intensive schooling and a lot of stuff that went with that too, so it counted for college credit.
What did you do after the service?
I went into the Los Angeles Police Department.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
And I retired from that, and then I went to the California Commission on Peace Officers Training, where we established all of the requirements for selection of all law enforcement officers in the state, in whatever category, and there are a number of different categories of people who are peace officers, and all of the training requirements.
Wow. So you ended up a full career within the law enforcement then?
Yeah, I did.
That explains why you're in such good shape, I assume.
I don't know if that's the reason, but yeah, it's part of it.
Now, so you did, towards the tail end of the war, after you got held back because you were such a good trainer, you ended up flying over to the South Pacific, or not? Did you end up staying stateside, or?
No, I ended up at the end of the war over there. I flew a few brief combat missions, and then I stayed for the occupation.
What was it like flying a combat mission? Where did you fly out of?
Well, it was off of, let's see, what's the name of that island? I think that at my age, my memory isn't always coming back quickly with these. Whatever, it was one of the islands I had, some of the islands I had down there. So it came up, the group, 49th Fighter Group, the group that I joined was one of the very first fighter groups to go into the Pacific Theater. And they started out in Australia and went on north up through the islands. The island hopped on up through, and I joined them on up in the one of the northern islands. And
Was that so? Would like each day you would have a mission to go up and fly, or how often do you remember how often you flew?
well, it depended on the circumstances. You could fly daily. You could fly sorties and missions. You could go several flights a day, depending on how close you were to whatever the action was. Or they could be long range, in which they would be a long one. Those long range flights were torture in a fighter plane.
Tell me about that. Tell me about getting ready for the flight, getting in the fighter plane, and then what it was like getting in there. What all did you wear? And then when you got in there, how much room did you have, and what was it like?
Well, flying in the Pacific area itself, the temperatures are normally pretty comfortable as far as the flight equipment that you would wear. But you wore a flight suit, which was kind of they were khaki colored, of course, light colored denim material that you put on over your uniform.
Oh, really?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they weren't very heavyweight, but they had big pockets down at the calf area in front where you could stuff your maps, and then they had slits through and to the side that weren't pockets where you could put your hands into your pockets if you had to get something out, and a place for pencils and pens and stuff like that where you write down, jot down notes or anything of that kind. And hearing device, much as the kind you're wearing there, and a canvas helmet, just like the World War I pilots used to wear, and a parachute, which was heavy. And times if you're going to be flying over water, you wore a life vest.
Is that one of the Mae West?
Mae West type,
inflatable.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how much, once you got in your cockpit, were they spacious planes, or were you just jammed in there?
For the most part, they were. If you were a really big person, it could have been probably. But, well, the P-38 had lots of room, and the P-51 had lots of room. And the seats are adjustable long before they developed adjustable seats in automobiles. So.
Now, I assume you never had to use your parachute. You never put one down.
Yeah, I did. I had to get out once.
What happened there? What was that like?
Well, this is late on in the war up in the northern part of the Philippines, up there above Luzon, up in the tip of the island. It was on what they called a search and destroy mission. It was after they were cleaning up the Japanese in the area, up in the mountains. The flight of 3 I was leading, and we came down along the edge of a range of mountains where there had been troop sightings reported, and they were there because they got me with ground fire. And first I was aware of it was when P-51 had a water-cooled, liquid-cooled engine. It was a V12 Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, marvelous airplane. But it was susceptible. You could shoot yourself down in it, as a matter of fact. One of the few planes you could do that in. If you came in on a strafing mission where you come in at an angle like this and you go across the ground, you're not going to dive into the ground. You're down like this, but the plane's moving forward too. You get the angle right, and you're shooting and strafing. The bullets are going down like that, and they're ricocheting up this way. Well, if you're coming across fast, at a proper angle, they can ricochet right into you. You can run into your own bullets. And if they hit anywhere into your cooling system, well, you're out in serious trouble. Whereas one of those radial engines or something of that kind, you could knock half the cylinders off of them and they'd still run. But you know, as in my case, is that when you get a big puff of steam out of the front end of the thing, that things are going wrong. It doesn't take very long to empty the cooling system, and then the prop seizes, and then there's all hell to play. So you pull up, roll over. As we used to say, you push the canopy back, stand up, and salute. Turn it back to the taxpayers of the United States and bail out. Fall out if you can. That's.
So you actually, do you roll it upside down and pump the canopy that way, and then?
You pull the canopy first. Try to gain altitude if you can, because you want if you're down low as I was, you try to get as much altitude as you can, but you want to get out also for that prop seizes and tears itself off. It freezes the engine up. There's problems, and they're hard to get out of anyhow. You know, one of my classmates was flying them up out of China, and he got shot down, broke his leg in 9 places.
Darn. Somebody plugged in a coffee pot. So you were telling about a friend of yours that broke his leg in 9 places getting out was that because of the, did he break it when he was getting out?
Yeah, broke it on the horizontal stabilizer. You have to get clear of the airplane or it'll run into you. So that was difficult to get out of. P-38s were difficult to get out of because they had those twin booms back there and that big stabilizer that ran all the way across. You know, if you ran into that, well, you bought the farm.
So when you went out, did your all of your training come like that, or were you panicking when? I mean, I imagine getting shot down. It's pretty scary.
Well, you don't get scared till afterwards. You know, you don't have time to react to anything like that. All you're doing is instinctively doing those things that you know you have to do to clear the airplane, and you worry about what happens after. You know, it's like you go on a really bad flight, and you get scared when you come home and get out of the airplane and start thinking about, my God, what did I just do, or what have I been through? It happens while you're involved in all this. You're too much involved to be concerned with anything else except what's going on.
So when you bailed, where did you then land? Did you land out in the water or on?
No, I landed in a tree. And, well, I was still pretty low, and the chute hadn't completely opened yet. It's what they call a streamer. It was just opening when I went down through a tall tree, fortunately. And the chute caught up and above and stopped me. So, yeah.
And did you then have to cut yourself out of that, or how did you?
Yeah, I cut myself out and dropped to the ground, which didn't help. And the other 2 planes that were with me on my wing, they spotted where I went down. They circled around and fired bursts into the area around in case there was anybody there from the local Japs. See that they stayed away from me. And I wasn't very far from the coast, so I made my way down, picked up a trail there, not far away, and made my way down to the coast and got picked up by one of the Navy's big flying boats, Air Sea Rescue.
Boy, that had to be. I mean, your mind's got to be just going a million miles an hour when that happened. not knowing who's out hiding in the woods or.
Yeah, yes, you know how a rabbit feels.
You're the hunted, not the hunter at that point.
That's exactly right, yeah.
So what'd they give you for protection? I mean, did you carry a gun in the stuff you carried, or once you got on the ground, you had no?
They usually carried a .45 automatic, it's a standard Army issue.
Just a revolver then.
No, automatic.
Huh. What? So did you? Once you gave that plane back to the taxpayers, did you go back up flying again after that?
Oh yeah, sure. It's just
Get back on that horse and.
if you got all your pieces, you don't have anything else to do. That's no excuse. No.
Now you ended up in Japan after the occupation?
Yeah, I did.
What was that like? What was your duty while you were over there? Were you help getting people-
Fly.
Just
I was stationed up on the northern island, Hokkaido, and ours was was a peacekeeping mission for one thing, and the occupation was very uneventful. There were no serious incidents of any kind that occurred anywhere that I was ever aware of. The Japs, when they stopped fighting, they became very submissive, and nobody knew anybody that had been a soldier in the war, and all of the women's husbands had been in the band and cooked in the kitchen, and that was the size of it, you know. Very nice people. And Dougie and her husband were there at that same time. They were down in the Tokyo-Yokohama area, which is a pretty populous area. They had advantages that we didn't have up there in Hokkaido, which was pretty remote, really. Our field had been a Navy base, and it was well constructed, because this is usual. The Navy does things in a very deluxe manner compared to the Army. But they had severe weather up there, so the buildings were designed for cold weather. All concrete, double wall, double windows, steam heated, central steam heat from everywhere. So that was the same for everybody, officers and enlisted personnel and everybody else. And I was a number of different things. We were very short-handed when I first got up there. It was right after the war. And so I wore several hats. I was intelligence officer, operations officer, half a dozen other things I can't remember right now. But gradually, as more people arrived, I gave up most of those things, and I became operations officer. That was my principal duty for a long time.
I heard a lot of veterans talk about during that time actually being able to tour around the city they were in a little bit. Did you get a chance, or was it still some fear of there might be some Japanese still with weapons?
Nothing. No way anywhere. No, nothing of that kind. As I say, I don't know of an incident of that kind ever having occurred anywhere. We got the newspapers that were published by the U.S., whatever they call themselves. It was a regular newspaper that had been published in Europe and everywhere else by the military services, and it had all the news that was everywhere. And as operations officer, I had access to everything that happened anyhow. Or as as intelligence officer, I had access to that and a lot of other stuff, so I knew everything that was going on. All the plans that what we did part of the time up there is that we were the same distance from Vladivostok, Russia, as we were from Tokyo. So when we flew not infrequent training missions down to the Tokyo-Yokohama area, down to Johnson Air Base, which was the big air base there, they were the same as it would be if we were performing a mission over Vladivostok or the coast of Russia. The Russians were never too friendly people, and they were very suspicious, as you know. But we had planes stationed at our base occasionally. The Navy sent up a big B-24 and a crew, and they helped answer the question to stuff we had stored in one of our hangars that we didn't use for planes. but it had big stocks of all kinds of stuff in there that we were just told to hold on to, and someone would get it someday. And they didn't tell us anything beyond that. So this Navy plane showed up one day with a Navy crew on it, and they said that's their stuff. So what they did was that they flew long-range, long-time missions along between Japan and the Russian territories over there, and up off of Sakhalin Island, which the Russians had taken over from the Japanese, and I don't think they still let the people get back and forth from Sakhalin to Japan. Families are separated because it was entirely inhabited by Japanese. And then we also had our own planes that came up. In fact, at one time later, after I left there, the B-29 got shot down up there by the Russians. So sorry, we didn't mean that to happen, kind of thing, yeah. But I swore they used to. We put out spotters on the corners of the island at various places, Hokkaido, a long way from the base. One of them called in once. The weather used to come in. It was the islands down here, and the weather would come in from the Russian area. It was just in a shelf like that. You know how a weather front moves in? So the front clouds move in, and then way behind that, the rest of the storm moves in. Pretty soon it'd cover us and go on by. As they say, we had some pretty heavy storms. Snow, we'd have snow piled 15 feet on both sides of the runways when they were cleared. But the guy that was out on the end of the island says, I think you ought to know this. He says, you got a flight of what was it, 9 geese moving over your area at 300 knots. So when we were night flying, and since I had been an instructor in the training schools, I had all of the skills of being able to set up training programs. So when they needed to keep the pilots' skills up to date, they needed to do night flying. You can't just turn a bunch of airplanes loose in the air and say, go out and fly and then come back. You had to have them scheduled for takeoff and landing and positions to be in, so we'd stack them up in the air, and then you'd have to work out a stacking program to where when an airplane took up, another one came down, and you'd run them up through 3 stacks. And I was the only one on the base that had the knowledge as to how to do that, so I was fairly useful in that respect.
And that's all running dark, right? I mean, no lights at all in their night training?
Oh yeah, this was but the Russians used to come down and fly through our pattern at night. They had jets and we had prop-driven planes, and every once in a while there'd be a big bright light about this big. If you wanted to believe in extraterrestrial things, this was it, where some of them may have come from. So there would just be this big, round, bright light that would just move around and through your pattern and disappear.
So was that your first jet you saw then? The Russian jet, or?
Well, all you saw was a bright red spot, so. But what we used to do, they'd come down and do that to us at night. We'd get up in the daytime, we'd get up to altitude, 38,000 feet or so, way high. And then we would just peel off and make a big split S down across the end of the island over there with our gun cameras on, shoot everything we could as they came down. We'd be home before they could take off, so.
Wow. Do you remember where you were when you heard about Hiroshima, when you heard the bomb had been dropped?
No, I don't remember it. I was flying around someplace, I guess. But one of the most memorable things that I had that took place there, on occupation, and I cite that because of the fact that I think it's one of those things that, you say, can this be true? Is there a God or a guardian angel, or what is it that looks after? Some things are too much to be coincidence, but then you can't say that they happen for any reason other than that either. But we used to take flights, as I mentioned, down to the Tokyo-Yokohama area to Johnson Air Base, which is the big field there, which were training flights. And we'd gone down there on one training flight because they had a big bunch of dignitaries that were in there from Washington, D.C., and they put on what they called a firepower demonstration. So they had the three groups from the island. They had the one from the southern island and the ones there at Johnson and our base. So we had three squadrons in a group, and each squadron had 25 airplanes, so we had 75 airplanes. So that was a collection of three times 75 number of airplanes there to go down and put this firepower demonstration on. And what you do is that part of the planes are loaded with bombs, 500-pound bombs, and part of them with napalm, which is 150 gallons of flaming gasoline. So you come in over a target, and they had I don't know where they picked the area, how they picked. Flying in formation as we had to, it was so tight you didn't have any idea where you went. The only person who knew where you were going was the guy who was leading all this. So anyhow, we had 75 airplanes, and these other two groups had 75 airplanes. So you came in, this is a firepower demonstration. You come in and you lay down either two or, if you're carrying bombs, you got 400 or 500-pound bombs. If you're carrying napalm, you got two of these big napalm tanks. So you come in with the bombs, and you drop them all over everywhere, or pinpoint them, whatever the particular thing is, which opens up holes in everything. Then they come around with the napalm, and they fill all those holes with flaming gasoline. And then you come around with 3,500 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition, and you shoot everything full of holes that hasn't been hit before. So you can picture that was pretty spectacular kind of thing. But anyhow, we were on our way back from that, and we ran into real heavy weather coming down, again, as I say, from over the Russian side. And the colonel who was leading squadron, we were building a new base that was going to take over the one that we had down on northern part of Honshu, move it down from Hokkaido. And it would be more centrally located there, and it would be the central air base that would take care of international flights and everything else, bombers and the whole works. So it was under construction, but it hadn't been opened yet. And as that time as the operations officer, I knew about it. I had to go down there and check on things, see how they were going and all that, keep up charts and whatever. Well, the colonel, of course, knew about it, so he led his group over there. He took his 25 airplanes in, and then the second group, they tried to make it through and went a little bit further and decided that they couldn't do it, and they turned around and went back, except one guy who apparently had a hangover or had his radio off. He just flew straight on ahead. And I saw several years later where a Japanese fishing boat had fished him up out of the harbor there. And but the guy that was leading our group, he had a hot date with the nurse there at the base, and he was going to get back to the base come hell or high water, which he almost did in his case. And I was flying at the very end of the group with two new pilots that had just come to the base and hadn't been oriented to the area at all. They not only didn't know our area, they had no idea where this new field was, or if there even was one. So when we finally convinced this guy, we got up into the area where we were running into freezing rain, and we weren't equipped for that. And the base kept saying, you can't land, the base is closed, it's sleet and snow and high winds, and the visibility is almost zero. So finally, wiser persons got to this guy to convince him that, hey, dummy, we can't get through it, you're going to have to go back. So he turned us around. Well, by this time, the weather had moved down to where there was just a little hole over the northern end of the island of Honshu there. He looked down on the Sargu Straits, and that's spelled with a T, T-S-A-R-G, something like that, which is one of the roughest pieces of water in the world anywhere, at best times. And you could see even from up higher as we were, huge dashing waves hitting the end of the island of spray. And it was just a hole, that was it. So he circled down. He said, break into trail and circle down. And I tried to bring these two guys with me because I knew they would get lost if they if I got lost, they'd get lost. But if they got lost by themselves, they didn't know where they were. I had some vague ideas. So anyhow, as I was watching coming down, these planes are spiraling down, and they'd hit the weather, they'd just disappear. Just never gone. Just one after another. Pretty soon they were all down, and I'm behind them. And you start hearing ahead of us people saying, where are you? And so I don't know. Where are you? I said, how the hell do I know? Can't see anything. What altitude are you on? Such and such an altitude. And someone says, so am I. What direction are you going? Such and such a direction. Well, I'm turning around and going back. So then our brave leader said, turn around and find the hole. So I'm confronted with the fact that there's 22 airplanes in front of me turning around and coming back, and I don't know what their altitudes are because they're all different altitudes, and they're all strung out all over everywhere, and I'm going to be flying into them. So I thought, well, I better start climbing, and most of them are down low. I'll climb as high as I can and then make a turn. Well, I should have climbed and leveled off and turned, but because these voices sounded so insistent about them going back and finding the hole, I made a turn. Turning on instruments, climbing and turning on instruments is not always the easiest thing to do. And with two guys on your wing, the wingmen pull in on you and they fly off of you. It's like just flying formation, same thing, and just watch you. So started the turn, and I was climbing, and I looked back, and this guy was there, and I looked down, and that guy was there, and I looked more, and I looked back up there, and this guy was gone. I looked down at that one was gone, and I thought, oh, Jesus, And I looked back to see if maybe I'd missed him, and when I looked back, I was looking at the ocean. I was coming down upside down, and I had about 200 feet of altitude, and I was moving fast. And yes, I panicked. I really did. But I rolled the thing out straight. And I admit there was panic in the cockpit there for a while because it spun my gyros. I didn't know what direction I was going. And at that altitude, there were cliffs off the end of the island that were higher than I was. So either I was headed towards Seattle or I was headed towards one of those cliffs. So first thing I did was try to pull up as far as I could into the base of the clouds without getting into them. And circled. And I could hear all these people saying, we're lost, the hole's gone, it's not there anymore. And just all kinds of air talk. And the people who were with me, I had no idea where they'd gone. I figured they'd probably gone into the ocean or something. But I did remember that since I was operations officer that we had what they call a GCA crew, ground controlled approach, done by radar. We had the original team that was developed for the Navy to do that. But the Navy didn't need them any longer. But we did. And they said, developed by Gilfellen Radio Corporation. So they sent them over to us. And that's another whole story, is how we got them, actually. They'd been sent to us, but they had lost their orders, and the people that had them at the big Transition Hotel in Tokyo didn't have their records either. We were down there one day on another mission and ran into these guys at the mess hall, or the bar, more likely. And they were telling us what they were, and we had no idea what it was. We'd never heard of it. One of the fellows who was with us remembered that one of our people on the base used to go out on weekends and check all around the area, and there was a big base the Japs were building nearby us that they were going to bomb the West Coast from. It was for long, heavy-range planes. And over there was stacked a bunch of equipment that was marked with military things on it, U.S., but we didn't have any record of it, and we had no reason to access it. But he remembered some of those things, so the fellow that was with us got on the phone, called up to the base, which was not easy to do because any time it snowed, our landline cable from the headquarters out to the radio transmission would get wet snow on it about that deep and break, and it was snowing up there. Anyhow, he called and he said, explained it to these people who put them on the phone, and they said, yeah, that's our equipment. So we got the only GCA crew in existence, the original developed crew and boy, the lives they saved. Anyhow, I knew that they were down there. We'd send them down to the new base to practice. And I thought, well, it was getting close to closing time. It was 4:30, I guess, and time's over 5 o'clock. Everybody goes off. Would have been a weekend. They'd had a weekend pass, and they'd have been gone. And civilians had been training our military people to do this. And so I called, I put out my call letters and called and heard nothing. And I called again. And I was still circling all this time. And I called again, and a voice came back to me. He said, "Identify yourself, and what do you want?" And not the exact words, but we're using irregular phraseology, you know, red fox, whatever you are. I said, "Well, we got 25 airplanes out here that are lost, and we need a homing directions into the base." And they said, "Stand by, we'll do it." So they got on the air, and they started, we got people ordered to where they would call in by their positions in the flight. And one by one, they got them zeroed in there. Well, by the time nobody was scattered so far, but what they knew that when some of the planes got directions, that was the direction they all needed to go. So they all started in that direction. So that pretty soon they weren't too far away. But I was the last one. I waited for the very end to make sure that everybody else had been picked up. So I'm out there flying around. And they gave me a heading to come in on, and I flew it for a little while, and I called back and said, "I don't like this heading. I think I'm going to get to Seattle quicker than I'm going to get to you." And the guy said, "Ooh, I'm sorry, we gave you a reciprocal heading. Turn around." So I had to make a 180. They gave me a new heading to go back. And by this time I had pretty much gotten control of myself, staring at those waves with the ice and all that. It hadn't been too much of a thrill. Anyhow, got in, landed at the airport. First time and only time in my life that I was coming in for a landing, they shot a red flare at me, and I thought, what are they doing that for? I got to get down. I'm almost out of fuel. And I realized, well, I wasn't slowing down the way I should, and I had the wheels down, but it still wasn't. I kept cutting the throttle back. And I thought, oh no, I had been cutting back, and I didn't have the wheels down. So I put the wheels down, and then I remembered I better put some flaps down too, because I still was going too fast. I got down safely, got in, and everybody was congratulating. I checked and found out that two fellows who'd been with me were down safely, and that was it. But, which is just routine stuff, except that night we gathered money to buy a couple of cases of beer from the officers' bar to take over to these enlisted crew that ran the GCA group. And what they found is that they had left the GCA shack, which was 4 or 5 miles off the end of the runway, and got in the 6x truck and were on their way back into the field because, as they said, this is open post, man. We got to get back there and get into town. So they were about halfway in, and the fellow who was in charge, the chief enlisted man, whatever he was, he says, "Hey," he says, "I think I forgot to turn the set off, equipment." And they said, "Big deal. What difference does it make? Nobody's going to bother it." And he said, "Well, I'm responsible." I said, "Well, forget it. Who's ever going to do that? Nobody ever vandalizes anything around." He said, "I don't care." He said, "I'm going to lose my stripes." And he hammered on the window to the driver, who complained about it too, and he says, "Take us back." So they drove back, pulled the truck up next to the shack. They got there. Not only had he not turned it off, he hadn't closed the door. So as he walked up to the building, they heard me calling, asking for a fix. How you like that? That's how close it came. If they hadn't have gone back after that, there'd have been 25 airplanes and 25 pilots gone.
Okay, you would have just been wherever.
Well, you can't bail out to survive usually. You don't know how you're going to survive. It's all mountainous. And you don't survive if you get out and end up in the ocean. That's for darn sure. So.
Well, you were looked over out there.
Yeah, so I think that's probably a really totally unusual and significant event from the standpoint of what did fate play in that particular event. That it saved all of our lives, and only because I was aware of the fact that there was a team down there to do this, but not that they'd even be there at that hour, and they'd left and came back, and it was only because actually he hadn't turned the radio off that he heard my voice. If he'd turned it off and the door was open, he wouldn't have done anything anyhow.
Now that's when you start shaking, is once you realize afterwards where you were at.
Yeah, that's when it hit you. Man, that was close. So yeah, that's if you believe in a god or a higher deity of some kind, that's like the guy in the shell holes in the World War I, in the trenches.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. That wasn't too bad, was it?
No, very interesting.
Boy, that's.
To a squadron over in Kempo, Korea. That's before it became Seoul. And we used to have to take equipment and stuff over to the men who were stationed over there out of our group. So that was flying all the way down from the top of, from the middle of Hokkaido down the full length of Honshu and across the Japanese Sea and up over to Korea. Flew over Hiroshima and all that. It was a fun flight. But we had a C-46, and I had never been checked out in a C-46. That's one of the bigger transport planes they had. Was flying with a friend of mine who had been checked out, and he wasn't eminently qualified, but he did know how to land and take off at least. and so we were halfway down the coast, and I don't know what we were stopping for. Fuel, I guess. I don't know why we would have had to stop down there for fuel. We hadn't gone that far. Anyhow, we were about halfway down the coast of Japan, and we decided to land at this airport for some reason or another. And he said, "You want to land it?" I said, "Sure, why not?" So, well, this thing sits 30 feet off the ground in the pilot's seat. And I leveled off, came in, leveled off beautifully. About 30 feet high. I guess. People in the control tower never say anything. They just say, take this runway, the wind is such and such, or when you're down, taxi such and such, or whatever. That's about as much as it's ever. No conversations beyond that. In this case, I came down, and the tower said, "Jesus Christ." So what happened is that we flew on over to Kempo that night, by the way. We were often accused of starting the war because we flew across the DMZ up there. We hadn't any idea where we were. Neither we hadn't bothered to figure our course on a map or anything else. I don't think we'd figure on it getting dark, but it was really dark when we got there. We got to one point where we figured we should be getting close to the field, and we could hear very faintly on the radio Kempo Field giving landing instructions to somebody. So pretty soon we came along to a place where there's 2 rows of lights on the field. It looked like running lights, and we knew Kempo was pretty primitive anyhow, smudge pots. So I figured, hey, this is it. So we wheeled around, and we gave our landing request and statements and all that, and wheeled around, and my buddy was flying the plane, and we lined up with it. It wasn't quite in line with the numbers they had given us for the direction of landing. It was about 15, 20 degrees off, but looked good enough to us. So we came in, made our approach, made a regular required approach, in and along and downwind leg, and started in on the final approach. And he says, "Okay," drop the gear, and I dropped the gear, and he says, "Okay, give me some flaps," and I gave him some flaps, and he says, "Give me the lights," and I gave him the lights. The lights came swinging down like this out of the bottom, and they light up everything just in a path as they come up like that. And just as they did, we picked up a big military bus, moved right into the middle of the lights, and stopped. And there were white faces and glistening eyes all looking in our direction, and hands up against the windows. And then pandemonium. They were going out the windows, they were going out the door, they were going out everywhere. And he said, "Full throttle," and I shoved the throttles on, and we were in landing configuration. We were down for all intents and purposes. We were through flying. We were almost out of airspeed. Full throttle. He says, "Jerk up the gear," and I pulled up the gear, and he said, "Milk up the flaps," and we were just trembling. We just scraped the top of that thing when we went over it. And we got up, and after we got through shaking, we tried to reorient, and we discovered we were probably still another 20 minutes from the field. And we didn't hear anything about that, except that years later, when I was on the police force there in L.A., as a detective, we were investigating some incidents, holdups in bars, and getting information and stuff, and we were waiting to talk to somebody, and there were two fellows sitting at the stool of the bar, and this one guy says, yeah, he says, there we were, he says, in the bus, we were getting ready to go on open post, he says, it was Friday night, and we were crossing this parade ground. He says, and here comes these dumbasses down with this airplane trying to land on us. That's part of the small world syndrome. Yeah. So yeah, there were people there, and they did know it.
That's Sir Dumbass to you.
Yeah. Yeah. I said, well, hey, that was me.